I didn't cry when they beat me. I didn't beg when they sold me. But I wept the day they freed us because I knew they had no idea what to do with a free black man. We did not become citizens. We became reminders. We walked the streets like the uneasy conscience of a nation that had won the war, but not itself. Slavery had ended, and yet slavery remained. It changed names, changed signatures, changed laws, and those who once broke our chains now built new ones. This is the story of how freedom became illusion, how victory turned into compromise, and how America looked away from its own mirror at the very moment it needed to look in. Subscribe to our channel if you believe truth should be told without decoration, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, because the story you're about to hear echoes in every hour. Peace did not come with fanfare. It came with emptiness. After the cannons, silence. After silence, shadows. And in those shadows, we, the freed, searched for ourselves. The war was over. On the fields of Virginia, the last soldier died for an idea he couldn't fully explain, the idea that one skin was worth more than another. In Washington, there were fireworks. In the papers, Union triumphant, Confederacy surrenders, America reunited. But what did that unity mean for me, a man who had, until recently, been bought and sold like livestock, a man whose body could be collateral for a loan and whose name didn't appear on his own birth record? In the shadow of the Capitol, they passed laws meant to change my life. The 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. It was a sentence that smelled of liberty and loopholes. Slavery abolished, except as punishment. That except left a door ajar, and through that door walked countless new forms of the old chain. I was in the halls when they debated those lines. I saw the smiles on the faces of men who had once called me property, not because they had lost, but because they knew the game wasn't over. The day Union troops entered Richmond, the enslaved stepped out of their cabins and dropped to their knees. They didn't know how to stand upright. They had nowhere to go, nothing to claim, no paper that said, "You are a man." Their first day of freedom began with nothing, no home, no land, no protection. We were freed and left in the ruins. Some stayed with their former masters because there was no other choice. Others wandered to cities where at least no one fired on them, and still others believed the promises. In January 1865, General Sherman promised 40 acres and a mule for every freed family. To us, that sounded like scripture. We did not ask for vengeance. We asked for land. Land we had tilled with our hands, soaked with our blood. Land that had paid for mansions in Boston, for plantations in Charleston, for fine clothes in Paris. But after Lincoln was killed, his successor, Andrew Johnson, gave that land back to the planters. The men who had once owned us now owned the land again, and we, once again, owned nothing. Federal troops remained in the South. Their presence, the only reason we could still walk the streets without chains. They patrolled, they observed, sometimes they even defended us. But to the hearts of Southern whites, they were occupiers. Cities felt divided, the freed and the humiliated, and both were angry, one because they still had no power, the other because they'd lost it. I often spoke in these towns. They threw stones at me, but they listened. A Freedmen's Bureau was established, an agency to help us transition, schools, legal aid, protection. We came there as if to a shrine. I saw former slaves learn to write their names, names that had once been written only in scars. But the Bureau was underfunded, overburdened, attacked from all sides. White Southerners saw it as a threat, proof that black people could be more than servants. And so they slashed its budget, then its staff, then its mission, until it vanished. And so came the moment when the guns were silent, the soldiers posted, the flags waving, but I knew peace had not come, because peace is not the absence of war. Peace is the absence of fear, and fear was everywhere. The men who had once chained me now smiled in courtrooms, because they knew no one would judge them. Laws were written in our name, but interpreted in theirs. I saw America celebrate the freedom of her slaves, but she never confessed that she had been a slaveholder. This was the beginning of freedom, with no textbook, no map, no signpost, and we would have to find our way when the road led into darkness. But I believed, because even if they would lie to us again, we would no longer be silent. And the voice of a free man is the first sound that tyrants fear. There are things worse than chains. For example, the illusion that you no longer wear them. Freedom, they said, signed, ratified, declared from every pulpit. And we believed. We wanted to believe, because what else was a people to do? A people stripped of everything but hope for centuries? The 13th Amendment, the loudest promise of freedom in American history. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. That except? We didn't understand it at first. It stood like a shadow at the end of the sentence, like a veiled but, too faint to hear amid the fanfare, but echoing through prisons, plantations, and courtrooms for generations to come. They said we were free, but it was freedom in a cage. No key, no map, no instruction, no protection, no reform, no acknowledgement that society was not ready. And while we were learning to pronounce the word freedom, America was already writing the manual for its restriction. A free man, they said, must work. But what to do with a free man who has no money, no home, no documents? Oh, the answer came swiftly. Arrest. The laws passed in southern states just after the war had a new name, black codes, and a clear goal to turn freedom into a technicality. Not working? Arrested. Looking for work from the wrong employer? Arrested. Can't prove lawful income? Arrested. All perfectly legal, all within the 13th Amendment. After all, it says clearly, except as punishment for crime. I stood in courtrooms and watched young men, black, free, hungry, sentenced for vagrancy. They were seeking work, and for that they were sent to labor, forced labor, in prisons or to private hands. Thus was born a system that would haunt us for generations, convict leasing. What did it mean? States arrested black men for anything. Judges, the same ones who once sentenced slaves, handed them to private enterprises. Factories, mines, plantations took these convicts as silent, cheap labor. Prisoners had no rights. They were beaten, starved, worked to death. Their lives were worthless because they were criminals, because they were profitable. The 13th Amendment, meant to be a sword against slavery, became the key to a new form of it. Slavery, renamed. The irony was cruel. I remember saying in Congress, we abolished the institution, but preserved the system. We tore down the plantation, but rebuilt the camp. We gave a man freedom and left the state the tools to take it back. During this time, Southern prisons swelled. Black men became the primary category of the incarcerated. This was no accident. This was a business model. The state earned money leasing convicts. Companies got nearly free labor, and society, the illusion of order. Slavery had evolved. The whip became law. The master, a judge, the overseer, a shareholder. And what of those not imprisoned? They lived in fear, in humiliation, in a society where their rights existed only on paper. In many states, freed people could not vote, could not serve on juries, could not hold public office. They were called free, but not equal. It was second-class freedom, freedom that could vanish without cause. I did not stay silent. I traveled the country. I wrote. I pleaded, not for pity, for logic. What stability can exist where millions live without rights, education, or representation? The answer was silence and stares. Stares that said, "We've given you everything. Don't ask for more." But I wasn't asking. I was warning. Because freedom unprotected becomes a memory, and a nation living in memory loses its future. The 13th Amendment was written in ink, but read in darkness. And instead of an age of emancipation, we entered an age of uncertainty, where prison could be a school, and school an unattainable dream. I had no illusions. I did not believe America would change overnight, but I believed it had the strength to look honestly at its history. Instead, it drew a new mask, legal, constitutional, modern, a mask under which old faces still ruled, old ideas still dictated policy, and old fears still shaped the future. And again, we stood at the door where freedom waited. But this time, the key was held by laws that were meant to protect it, and those laws were interpreted by the same voice that once whispered, "You are not a man." But the struggle was not over, for those who once forged chains were now rewriting constitutions. In the next chapter, we'll see how America, torn between ideals and fears, tried to give us not just liberty, but a voice. But can a voice be heard in a country that hasn't yet learned to listen? When the chains are taken off your wrists but written into law, slavery does not vanish. It becomes invisible and therefore more dangerous. America declared, "You are free." The South replied, "Very well, then we will write different rules." Freedom, pronounced in the capital, looked like punishment in the South, like revenge, like mockery. And while politicians in Washington debated ideals, the white elites of Dixie drafted new laws. They called them black codes. But the evil wasn't in the name. It was in how expertly slavery was transformed into order. Just yesterday, the black man had been a slave, no right to move, to own, to learn, to vote. Today, he was free, but required to have a labor contract, proof of residence, travel permits, proper behavior. The same chains, a different name. People often ask me, "Mr. Douglas, why do you react so fiercely to these laws?" Because I saw how they worked, not on paper, but in life. In Georgia, a black man could be arrested if he didn't prove reliable employment. In Mississippi, a freed woman could not leave her home without her employer's permission. In Louisiana, a black child was forbidden from attending school without special permission from the local council. In some counties, police demanded that black people wear special tags, like animals. And who passed these laws? The same men who had once led the plantations, the same who had voted for secession, the same who wept over the body of the Confederacy. The war did not change them. Defeat did not break them. It only inspired them. Because every time Washington looked away, the South wrote a new code, not for justice, but for control. When we protested, they said, "These are just local measures, temporary solutions." But the temporary has a habit of becoming tradition. We, Black Americans, became subjects of the largest social experiment in this country, formally free, functionally supervised. They said, without control, there will be chaos. But the control they built wasn't a response to fear. It was a way to preserve it. Were there good white people? Yes. Were there fair judges? Yes. But the system they created didn't need every man to be a racist. It worked on its own. These codes didn't whip. They frightened. They didn't scream. They spoke in the language of official documents. They didn't torture. They disciplined. And here lies the cruel paradox. In a country that now called every man free, the only legal form of life for a black man was dependence on a white employer. Don't work for him. You're arrested. Work for yourself. Fined for no contract. Protest. Charged with incitement. All within local governance. I said this at rallies. A law written not for protection but for control is the same whip, only signed by a judge. And when they saw us organizing, building schools, choosing leaders, the South created fear as political strategy. That's how the Ku Klux Klan was born. Not as a criminal gang, no. At first, just a veterans club, but quickly, a terrorist structure with a single goal: to terrorize the black community, to destroy solidarity, to make us silent. They came at night, in masks, on horses. They burned homes, dragged out men, lynched them. No trials, no evidence, no escape. And local authorities? They stayed silent, because often they wore the same hoods. I met women who had lost sons, fathers who buried their children for daring to learn, and they asked me, "Mr. Douglas, why are we still afraid?" I had no answer, because the truth might break them, because we were never truly free. And one more point. Black codes weren't just the South's doing. The North had its own order laws, its own zoning, its own quiet taboos. The difference? The South was open about it. The North masked it in civility. I dreamed that freedom was like light. Once lit, it could not go out. But I learned it must be protected. Every day, every hour, in every village, every street, every school, court, and office. Because even if freedom is written into the Constitution, it can still be erased from the faces of a people. They destroyed the chains, but left the cage and gave it a name, order. And yet, even inside that cage, we began to speak, to fight, to believe that a voice is a weapon. In the next chapter, we'll witness how Black Americans entered politics and how, for the first time, America had the chance to see that equality is not a threat, but an opportunity. The most dangerous thing to an empire is not a sword, but a citizen who believes he has the right to vote. Picture this. I, a former slave, standing on a stage in the outskirts of Buffalo, holding a piece of paper, facing a hall full of white laborers. On that paper, the text of the 15th Amendment. The room, silent. I read aloud, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Then I looked up and said, "I do not ask for this right. I remind you that I already possess it." That was a moment. a moment when America had a chance, a moment when we were not only freed, but began to enter the very fabric of the Republic. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all born in the United States. The 15th guaranteed the right to vote. These words were revolutionary. They could have changed everything. And for a few short years, they did. In the South, where just yesterday we were forbidden to marry, now we were electing mayors, judges, senators. In 1870, Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. senator from Mississippi. By 1872, 20 black Americans served in Congress. In many southern districts, black votes decided who would be governor. It was an explosion of hope, a living proof that even the cruelest system could crack, that even a slave could become a lawmaker. I remember visiting a school in Georgia. The teacher, black, the board, wooden, the children, barefoot, but their eyes ablaze. They knew why they were there, because education was our act of revolution, our weapon. We built churches, aid societies, newspapers, unions. We didn't just want equality. We were building it with our own hands. But equality is not just a right. It is a threat to those who've had a monopoly on it. And the further we advanced, the harsher the response became. The white South had not forgotten its defeat. It had only disguised it. And so came literacy tests, where whites were asked to read simple sentences, but blacks had to interpret the Constitution on the spot. Poll taxes, which priced out the poor, grandfather clauses. If your grandfather voted, so can you. And our grandfathers were in chains. People often asked me, is it true that black people aren't ready for politics? I answered, we were never ready for slavery, but that didn't stop you from throwing us into it. Now, we will decide what we're ready for. But the greatest danger wasn't in the laws. It was in fear. And once again, it wore a hood. The Ku Klux Klan, as we've already seen, rose to new heights. Now, they weren't just hunting teachers and farmers. They were assassinating elected officials. Dozens of black legislators were killed or forced to flee their districts. This was a counter-revolution happening under the cover of night, but with the blessing of daylight. The federal government reacted slowly. President Grant passed the Enforcement Acts, but Congress resisted, because when black votes began shifting power, the white South wasn't the only one panicking. The North was not ready for real equality either. Newspapers ran stories. Negroes cannot govern. Southern chaos. Better compromise than instability. Once again, a narrative of fear. Now no longer about savage slaves, but about incompetent voters. The idea that a black person could be equal wasn't just a political threat. It shattered the cultural myth of America, of divine hierarchies, of everyone in their natural place. I wasn't only fighting for the right to vote, I was fighting for recognition, that my mind mattered, that my voice was part of the national choir, not noise in the corner. We built a new South, but the old South waited, and its moment was coming. Equality was like spring. It had come, but its roots were not yet deep. The idealists in Washington hoped that a few amendments and some bureaus would be enough. But we were not fighting for mercy. We were fighting for a seat, for the right not to be guests, but stewards in our own house. Because what is equality if it is not protected? What is democracy if it can be undone in the name of peace and business as usual? I stood on Capitol Hill and watched the wind of change grow still. Soon, a retreat would begin, but not yet. For now, we held. We still believed, because never before in this nation's history had a former slave voted and elected his own governor. And now he did. And that meant America still had a chance. But a chance is not a guarantee. And just as we began to write a new chapter, others were preparing to erase it. In the next chapter, we'll see how money, land, and economic dependency became the new chains, and how slavery traded the whip for a contract. They took away the whip, but left chains in contracts, in debts, in leases. Slavery was abolished, but the struggle shifted to a new battlefield, the economic one. Hope rested on two pillars, land and capital. Land, so that we could work for ourselves. Capital, so we could begin life with something of our own. In 1866, Congress passed the Southern Homestead Act. On paper, it was a breakthrough, cheap land for white and black farmers alike. In reality, most plots were either inaccessible or seized by white speculators. What was left to us was swamp, or a promise. Then we placed our faith in something else, the Freedmen's Savings Bank. It was created in 1865 just for us. We, the freed, deposited $5, $10, $50, everything we had. I myself supported this institution. I called it proof that freedom could be not just a dream, but a reality. The bank grew quickly, but even quicker, it collapsed. The panic of 1873 hit the economy. The bank had invested in risky projects. There was no proper oversight. Mismanagement was rampant. In 1874, the bank failed. Thousands of freed people lost everything, some their life savings. In the best cases, 60% was returned years later. In the worst, nothing. I saw the faces of those standing in lines outside the bank offices. Empty pockets, empty eyes, empty trust. They told us, save, and you'll be free. We saved, and they disappeared. So what remained? No land, no bank, no protection. What remained was sharecropping. That word sounded almost progressive, shared crop. But in reality, it was a new form of economic dependence. A black family rented a small patch of land. The landowner provided seed, tools, and food on credit. All agreements were verbal or written in contracts we couldn't read. After the harvest, the owner calculated what we owed. Almost always, everything. How? We asked. We worked all year. But math in these parts had always been white, and always against us. Year after year, families remained in debt. Move? No money. Complain? The judge was the landowner's cousin. Leave? That was vagrancy and a crime. A free person lived in a home they could not leave, worked land they could not own, fed someone else's family and couldn't feed their own. The Freedmen's Bureau, once tasked with helping us with law, schools, and support, was defunded and shut down by 1872. Politicians said, Reconstruction is over. We knew we had simply been abandoned. And so here we were, free. No land, no money, no protection. But we did not stay silent. We built cooperatives, mutual aid funds, black churches, and trade guilds. Later, in the 1930s, we would even create the Sharecroppers Union, one of the first rural workers' unions. Still, the truth remained. Debt was more terrifying than the whip, a contract more refined than a chain. It didn't tear muscles. It broke dignity. It had no shackles, but it never let go. Slavery died, but poverty did not. And poverty speaks silently, but everyone hears it when they have nothing to eat. And when land failed us, the bank vanished, and hope ran dry, only one question remained. What does freedom feed? In the next chapter, we'll see how the year 1877 became the year of betrayal, how federal forces left the South, how America abandoned us. and how one of the darkest chapters of history began, all in the name of restoring order. The worst betrayal isn't when the enemy kills you. It's when your ally steps aside and says, "This is no longer my fight." America had grown tired of war, tired of rebuilding, tired of us. In Washington, they spoke of stability, of unity, of national reconciliation. But we knew what that meant. Forget us. Sweep under the rug the truth that black people were still not truly free. Then came the election of 1876, Republican Rutherford Hayes versus Democrat Samuel Tilden. The result? Chaos. Both sides claimed victory. 3 states, South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, deadlocked. The country teetered on the edge of collapse. And then they made a deal. The Compromise of 1877, a backroom agreement never written into law, yet more devastating than many that were. The terms were simple. Hayes would become president. In return, federal troops would withdraw from the South. Power in the southern states would return to white, democratic governments. Reconstruction would officially end, and we would be left alone with the South. I remember that day. I was reading a newspaper when I saw the headline, "Hayes in the White House, South free from occupation." But we knew what it meant. We were no longer protected. The soldiers who once guarded polling stations packed their bags. The courts where black voices could once find justice fell back into the hands of former slaveholders. Elected black officials were declared illegitimate, and over it all, silence. Silence from the North. Silence from the press. Silence from America. They called it compromise for peace. But to us, it was peace without justice, peace without presence, peace without us. After 1877 began what historians would later call the Jim Crow era, a time of systemic segregation, violence, exclusion. But we called it simply, we had become shadows again. Black schools, starved, legal recourse, minimal, political participation blocked by rules we could not navigate. But most of all, fear. Because now the Ku Klux Klan had no leash. It wasn't just a terrorist group anymore. It was part of the local government. I spoke in Boston, in New York, in Chicago. I said, "This is not a compromise, this is surrender, not to the Confederacy, to indifference." Some argued with me. "No, Mr. Douglas," they said, "everything has been done. Equality is written in the Constitution." And I asked, but who now interprets that Constitution? Because law is not only words. Law is the people who apply it, and those people were no longer with us. After 1877, I watched hope die, slowly, quietly, not from a gunshot, but from averted eyes. History isn't only about who shouts. It's also about who stays silent when they should speak. We didn't just lose troops. We lost allies. We lost guarantees. We lost faith in promises. And from now on, everything we would achieve would be earned despite, not because of, this country. But even in this betrayed world, we did not vanish. In our silence, a new language began to form, a language of struggle, of faith, of unrest. In the final chapter, we'll explore what happened after Reconstruction, how Frederick Douglass ended his life, not in silence, but with a microphone in his hand, and why his words today sound as though he never left. Freedom is not a moment, not a law, not a gift. It is a road, chosen every day, and each generation either walks it or turns away. After 1847, after the silence, after the abandonment, we did not vanish. We did not become the past. We became a memory, learning to speak out loud. Because if once we were punished for speaking, Now they feared we might speak too clearly. I lived nearly 2 more decades after Reconstruction ended, and not a single year was easy. I was in Washington when segregation laws were passed on streetcars. I sat with presidents who shook my hand, but changed no policy. I buried friends taken not by age, but by hatred. And still, I spoke. In schools, in meetings, in churches, in Congress, even in my 70s, I said what I said at 30. No man can give you freedom. It is not granted, it is taken. In 1895, hours before I died, I spoke to a women's gathering in Washington. Young black activists were there, fighting for the vote. They asked if the struggle was still worth it, when everything seemed to push back. I said, yes, because the moment you stop fighting, they'll remember how convenient your silence used to be. After I passed, they called me the most famous Negro in America, the orator reformer, the self-educated slave. But I didn't want to be remembered for who I was. I wanted to be remembered for what I stood for. I was not perfect. I was wrong sometimes, too sharp, too radical, too demanding. But I believed in people. Inside each of you is the one who once sat in darkness, the one who learned to read, the one who learned to speak, the one who stepped onto the street, not as a slave, not as a subject, but as a participant in history. Freedom is not what you have. It's what you do with what you have. We walked from plantations to parliaments, but the road continues. When someone asks, what has changed? I want you to answer, not with dates, but with actions. Because freedom isn't carved in stone. It's made in tomorrow's choice. If you've listened this far, you are already part of this road. You are not a bystander, not an audience, not a guest. You are the one to whom the torch is passed. Remember, history is not yesterday. It is always today. Subscribe to our channel if these stories speak to you. Leave us a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Because this story, like freedom, belongs to all of us.